Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. We're glad you're here. If you're settling in for the night, make yourself comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, pull up the covers, and let the story unfold slowly, like mist across a quiet field. If you're enjoying these calm, thoughtful journeys into the mysteries of the past, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing where in the world you're listening from. It helps others find their way here too. Tonight's story begins with a shed. Nothing special, just an old wooden shed in a sleepy Oregon town, painted forest green and hidden behind a fence that leaned ever so slightly to the left. It was the sort of place you'd pass without thinking, without looking twice. But for the townspeople of Shelton Falls, that garden shed would soon become the center of one of the most baffling and quietly disturbing mysteries in recent American memory. This isn't the kind of case that made national headlines. There were no chase scenes or sirens, no courtroom sketches splashed across tabloids. Just a series of increasingly odd events that whispered their way into local legend. It begins on a late August afternoon in 2008. The town had just finished celebrating its end-of-summer fair, a modest affair with funnel cake, a dunk tank, and a raffle for a handmade quilt. Eliza Harper, 74 years old and a retired schoolteacher, was walking her dog when she noticed something odd. Her neighbor, Charlie Denslow, hadn't been seen in a few days. Now that wasn't too unusual. Charlie was quiet, lived alone, kept to himself, especially since retiring from his job as a librarian a few years prior. He had no known family, few friends, and a schedule that rarely varied. But something about the silence bothered her. Charlie always fed the birds. He had half a dozen feeders hanging from trees in his backyard, and Eliza could see them clearly from her kitchen window. Every morning, rain or shine, he'd be out there with his little bag of seed, humming to himself. But today, they were empty. Not a single chickadee in sight. Eliza lingered at the fence, squinting through the tangled vines. She called out once, "Charlie," but the wind carried her voice away. By the next morning, she'd made up her mind. She called the non-emergency line for the Shelton Falls police. 2 officers came by that afternoon. They knocked. They walked the perimeter. Everything was locked. No signs of struggle. No smell of rot. No broken windows. Just quiet. Eventually they found the spare key hidden inside a dusty flower pot. The house was tidy. Lived in. But not recently. The refrigerator contained milk 2 weeks past expiration. A plate in the sink held the remains of what looked like toast. A single teacup sat beside it. The bedroom was made, the closet full. A book lay open on the armrest of the couch. Nothing dramatic, just a life, paused. But the shed, that little green structure at the edge of the yard, was locked. The officers jiggled the handle, padlocked. Strange but not alarming. After all, people kept tools, sometimes valuables. Nothing to suggest foul play. Still, something about it made Officer Nina Vasquez raise an eyebrow. She left a note requesting Charlie to check in, posted it to the front door, and asked Eliza to call again if anything changed. 3 days passed. Nothing did. Finally, they obtained a warrant. The officers returned with bolt cutters in hand. Eliza stood at her kitchen window, holding her teacup with both hands, watching like a character from a quiet ghost story. The lock snapped, the shed door creaked open, and everything changed. At first, it was the smell. Not putrid, not rotting, just wrong. Metallic, musty, like wet earth mixed with something synthetic. Inside, the shed was dark. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with mason jars and books. But what caught the officer's attention immediately was the chair. It stood in the middle of the floor, a high-backed wooden chair. Next to it was a single small table, and on the table was a camera, mounted, wired, pointed directly at the chair. Beside it, a laptop, closed, but powered. Its screen flashed faintly in the dark. They brought it back to the station. What they found on the hard drive, what slowly unfurled over the next few days, was stranger than anything Shelton Falls had ever known. At first, there were just recordings, dozens of them. Each video showed a person sitting in the chair, not tied, not struggling, just sitting. Some were men, some women, some young, others old. Each one stared directly at the camera. In every video, the same soft voice could be heard behind the lens, calm, gentle. There would be silence. Then in almost every clip, the subject would begin to speak. And what they said wasn't right. Some recited names, not their own. Some recounted childhoods that didn't exist. Others told stories that sounded rehearsed, stilted, surreal. "I grew up in Michigan," said one man. "My father was a locksmith. My mother raised peacocks." Police traced the video. That man, he had never lived in Michigan. His father was an accountant. His mother died when he was 3. Another woman said she was born in the Ukraine. Spoke about long winters, horse-drawn sleighs, ice fishing. She was actually from Delaware. In every case, the subject seemed calm, even entranced, like they believed what they were saying. Some footage was only a few minutes long. Others stretched over hours. In one, the same man returned multiple times, his identity shifting with each session. "I was once a banker," he murmured. "Then I was a sailor. Then I was nothing." The police were stunned. The first assumption, naturally, was that these were actors. That Charlie Denslow, the quiet librarian, had been filming some kind of art project, a psychological experiment, a documentary. But then came the second wave of information. When they began identifying the people in the videos, at least those they could trace, it turned out that several had been reported missing, in different states. Over a 10-year period, all were now accounted for, safe, alive, living under their real names again. But none had ever linked their missing time to Shelton Falls. None had remembered the shed. Until now, one by one, detectives reached out, and what they heard chilled them. Each person remembered vague fragments. A man with kind eyes, a room with no windows, a sense of losing time, of forgetting, of not knowing where they had been or why. One woman, Claire, said she'd believed for years that she had suffered a psychotic break, that the 6 months she couldn't remember were simply lost to mental illness. She cried when she saw the footage. "That's me," she whispered. "But that's not me." All told, 23 individuals were identified across the videos. 8 had vanished for weeks, 11 for months, 4 for over a year. In every case, they reappeared far from Shelton Falls. No one had ever suspected a connection, until now. And yet, there was still no sign of Charlie Denslow. His car was gone, his bank accounts untouched, his email inactive. No cell signal, no social media. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Was he abducting people, brainwashing them, or was he somehow helping them? The local press began to whisper about the identity man, a recluse who didn't steal identities, but gave them. The FBI became involved. Profiles were drawn. Analysts debated whether Charlie was a sociopath, a savior, or something in between. A few theories suggested the most disturbing possibility yet, that the people in the videos weren't being told what to say. They were being convinced. The chair, the setup, the calm voice, the repetition. It was reprogramming. Not torture, not coercion, but persuasion. And no one knew why. The garden shed in Shelton Falls, Oregon, was now sealed with crime scene tape. Inside, forensic teams worked in silence, dusting every surface, cataloging each item, treating the space not as a rustic backyard outbuilding, but as a portal into something unsettling. Charlie Denslow, the mild-mannered librarian, who had once passed unnoticed through the town's coffee shops and post office lines, was no longer just a quiet neighbor. He was now the focal point of a national investigation into what some began calling the borrowed identity case. The term sat uneasily in the mouths of those using it. It wasn't quite right. Identity theft suggested money, fraud, gain. What Charlie had done, if he had done anything at all, was stranger. It wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about convincing others they already were. Detectives pored over the recordings. A total of 42 video files were recovered from the laptop. Some were corrupted, but most were intact. The dates stretched over more than a decade, from as early as 1997 up to the final entry, dated just 1 week before Eliza Harper had made her call to police. They noticed a pattern. Each subject in the videos appeared more than once. They came back, sometimes after a few days, sometimes after months, but with each return, they seemed less themselves. In one early video, a young man named David J., identified through missing persons reports, appeared confused and hesitant. "I don't understand why I'm here," he said to the camera. His hands fidgeted. "You keep asking me who I am. I told you. I'm me." The voice behind the lens, steady and unthreatening, responded. "You told me you were a photographer, but in the last session, you said you ran a motel in Barstow." David shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." The voice didn't argue, just asked the question again. "Who are you, David?" The videos continued over time. David's answers began to shift. "I think my name was Carl, or maybe Dean. I remember the motel. I remember heat." On his final recording, he was smiling. "I've always lived in Nevada," he said. "I take care of guests. My wife makes the best lemon pie. My daughter paints. We have a dog named Finch." None of it was true. David had grown up in Vermont. No wife, no children, no dog. When he was found in Arizona years later, he was going by the name Carl Merrick and running a small roadside inn. He had no memory of the name David. It wasn't a game. It wasn't theater. It wasn't a scam. It was transformation, and Charlie Denslow had orchestrated it. But why? Back in Shelton Falls, residents were uneasy. The town was small, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where the grocery store still had handwritten signs, and the library used a date stamp machine. Charlie had been part of that rhythm. He shelved books quietly, nodded at checkout. Once he had given a talk about 19th century poetry. People remembered his soft voice, his hands always slightly trembling, his fondness for chamomile tea. No one had seen him in over a week. Flyers went up across 3 states. The FBI expanded the search. His car, a rusting green Honda Civic, was found at a gas station in Northern California. It had been there for 5 days, unnoticed. Inside were neatly folded clothes, 2 novels, and a set of burned DVDs. They contained the same videos from the shed. There was no note, no fingerprints other than Charlie's. No blood, no signs of distress, just a full tank of gas and a radio tuned to classical music. The trail stopped cold. As investigators dug deeper into Charlie's past, they found little. He had arrived in Shelton Falls in 1994, rented a modest 1-bedroom cottage from a retired farmer, paid in cash for years, eventually took a part-time job at the library, and slowly blended into town life. He told people he was from Idaho, but when the FBI checked, there was no record of a Charles Denslow born in that state during the year he claimed. No birth certificate, no school records, no family. When they ran his prints, the result came back as unidentified. It was as if he had started existing in 1994. Nothing before, nothing certain after. That's when the whispers began. By now the media had caught on. Not the mainstream networks. This wasn't the kind of story they could package neatly between ads. But the fringe, the curious, the conspiratorial, they clung to it. Podcasts ran specials. Reddit threads filled with theories. Was Charlie part of a psychological experiment? A cult recruiter? A rogue hypnotist? Or something more disturbing? There was a theory that gained traction. They called it the identity transfer hypothesis. It suggested that Charlie wasn't just manipulating memories, he was removing them, stripping people of their pasts, one layer at a time, until nothing was left but the version he constructed. Not with violence, not with drugs, but with repetition. Psychologists consulted on the case offered mixed opinions. Some said it was possible, under conditions of isolation, stress, and persuasive influence, for a person to adopt a new identity. That cults had done it. that certain techniques could cause a kind of induced dissociation. Others disagreed. This isn't amnesia, one expert said. This is architecture. These people didn't forget. They were rebuilt. And always at the center of it sat Charlie, the gentle librarian with no past, the man who taught people to believe stories that weren't their own. Then came the second discovery. During a routine evidence review, an analyst noticed something strange. In the background of one of the recordings, barely visible through a crack in the shed's wooden wall, was a neighbor's garage light. It flickered in a pattern. That neighbor, now deceased, had installed the light in 2001. But the video in question was dated 1998. It wasn't possible. Not unless the date was wrong. The team reviewed the metadata, then checked others. Slowly a realization dawned. The videos weren't in chronological order. In fact, some of the oldest files had the most recent timestamps. Others were clearly copied from older hardware. Someone had deliberately shuffled the timeline. They brought in digital forensics, hidden deep in the laptop's directory structure. Beneath layers of dummy files and corrupted data, they found a folder. Encrypted, obscured, but accessible. Inside more videos, more names, and one document. A list, 28 names, some crossed out, some underlined, some with question marks beside them. Each name matched one of the individuals in the videos, except the last one. The last name was not yet seen in any footage. It was written in capital letters, alone on the final page. Ni. The implications were horrifying. Had Charlie planned to use his own methods on himself? Had he already done so? Had he forgotten who he was? Or worse, had he never known? The document was unsigned, but something about the tone, terse, clinical, full of meticulous observations, suggested that Charlie had been conducting a long personal study, a study of self-obliteration. One line, scrawled in shaky handwriting at the bottom of the final page, haunted investigators for weeks. It read, "To erase is not to harm. It is to begin again. I only did what they asked." Who were they? There was no answer. A week after this discovery, the final anomaly surfaced. A package arrived at the police station. No return address. Postmarked from Boise, Idaho. Inside was a small black notebook. The first page read, "This is not my real name. Then you're looking for someone who never existed." The pages that followed were filled with dense, meticulous handwriting, timelines, observations, patterns. The author had tracked the people he filmed, recorded their habits, their fears, their histories. One entry described a man named Peter, who wore his trauma like a coat, and longed for a simpler story to live inside. Another described a woman named Hannah, who had survived a cult in her teens, and still watched doorways when she entered a room. But the final entries focused on something else, on himself, or rather, on the absence of self. Every story I tell becomes truer than the last. I forget what was real. Maybe nothing ever was. If identity is memory, then mine is a borrowed room. I am a librarian of lives. The notebook ended with a final line. I have been everyone. And now I will be no one. There were no prints on the notebook. No DNA. The mystery remained. Charlie Denslow was never found. The people he had recorded returned to their lives. Some shaken, some strangely comforted. All changed. And in Shelton Falls, the Green Garden shed was eventually dismantled. But Eliza Harper kept the chair. She said it seemed wrong to throw it away. It had been 6 months since Charlie Denslow vanished. Shelton Falls had quieted down again. The news trucks moved on. The national interest faded. Another case with more compelling images, or a clearer villain, had taken its place in the public eye. But the people in the town still remembered. They remembered the shed, the recordings, the faces of strangers who were no longer strangers. And most of all, they remembered how close the silence had crept. How long they'd missed what was happening right next door. The town library reopened its archive room. It had been closed during the investigation since it was Charlie's domain, the one place in town where he had exerted total control. floor-to-ceiling cabinets, label makers, quiet drawers of microfiche. Nothing seemed out of place, but still people had hesitated to enter. Now it had to be catalogued. A new librarian named Genevieve took on the task. She was young, thoughtful, the kind of person who asked permission before touching someone else's pen. She had moved to Shelton Falls for quiet. She stayed because of something else, something unspoken, a pull she couldn't explain. It started on a Monday morning. Genevieve unlocked the archive room and sat at Charlie's old desk. She opened the first drawer on the left and found a stack of index cards, neatly labeled. But they weren't books or titles. They were names. Dozens of them, each with a set of numbers, and what looked like shorthand observations. David J., confused but docile, responds to heat. Helen S. recurs dreams of water. Forgetting mother. Mark Verve, resistant. The names matched those on the encrypted list recovered from Charlie's laptop. Genevieve paused. She could have reported it right away, could have walked the cards down to the sheriff's office, but instead she kept reading. Something about the handwriting felt familiar, as if it were already known to her fingers before her eyes. One card near the bottom simply read Genevieve Arve. Arriving soon. High potential. She stared at it for a long time. Her own name, her initial, and a note she didn't understand. There was no date, no location, no signature. She placed the card back in the drawer and closed it carefully. Her hands trembled. Not out of fear, exactly, but something quieter. A sense of being watched from the inside. She never told anyone about the cards. Not then. Meanwhile, the FBI was not finished. The case had become something of an internal curiosity, filed under anomalous psychology, but not closed. An agent named Cassandra Lynn was assigned to the case in the spring. She specialized in memory manipulation, cult behavior, and psychological conditioning. When she read the initial reports, she was skeptical. Too neat, she thought. Too mythic. But the more she read, the more the shape of the story disturbed her. It wasn't just the garden shed. It was the pattern. Over the next few months, Cassandra began cross-referencing missing persons cases that matched certain behavioral anomalies. People found alive but with altered identities, memory gaps or personality changes. She set parameters. The changes had to occur post-1990, within specific regions, and exhibit similarities to the known victims from Charlie's tapes. What she found startled her. At least 9 additional individuals showed strong correlation. None had been linked to each other. Different states, different backgrounds, but they all had gaps. All had transitioned suddenly to new lives without explanation, and each had interacted with a man whose description, when filtered for ambiguity, was similar: tall, thin, soft voice, tremor in the hands. One described him as a therapist with eyes that didn't blink. Another said, "He didn't talk much, but he remembered everything I ever said." Still another could not recall his face at all, only the sound of pencil scratching on paper. In every case, the man had a different name, a different story. Cassandra began to suspect the unthinkable. Charlie Denslow hadn't disappeared. He had relocated. In August, a small motel in Montana reported a strange customer. He stayed in room 7 for 3 weeks, paid in cash, wore a plain gray sweater every day. When asked for ID, he showed a library card. Not a state-issued one. A custom-made card labeled Archivist 006. The clerk kept the card. Something about the man unnerved her. The name on it was James Quayle. Cassandra drove out to the motel. The man had already left. No prints in the room, but a sheet of paper had been tucked under the mattress. It contained a single line: "The truth is only unbearable when it doesn't belong to you." The paper was smooth, ivory, and stamped in the bottom right corner, with a small emblem, a key inside a circle, inside a triangle. Cassandra traced the symbol. It wasn't known to any official group, but it had appeared once before. On the last page of Charlie's notebook, she had a copy. She flipped to it. Same symbol, same size,
Same placement. It hadn't been a flourish. It had been a signature. Genevieve started dreaming. In her sleep she saw the garden shed, not as it was but glowing, bathed in warm light. Inside, the recordings played in reverse. People walked backward into the room, sat upright, spoke their names confidently, unlearned what they had been told. In one dream she stood inside the shed. The chair was empty. She held the camera. But when she looked down at her hands, they were not hers. They were older, thinner. A tremor danced through the fingers. She woke up sweating. Each morning she tried to shake it off. Blamed the late nights, the dusty air, the weight of the town's history. But the feeling clung to her, like a coat she couldn't take off. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to the archive room, sat at Charlie's desk, opened the drawer with the index cards. The one with her name was missing. She searched the drawer twice, then 3 times, removed each card, checked behind them. Gone. In its place was a blank card, and a pen, the same kind Charlie had used. She picked it up, looked around, listened to the silence, then without knowing why she wrote, "My name is Genevieve R. I work in a library, but I do not remember how I got here." She dropped the pen, stared at the words, and knew deep in her chest that she hadn't written them for the first time. 3 weeks later, Cassandra Lynn stood in the garden shed. The crime scene tape was gone, the equipment removed. The walls were bare now, though faded outlines still marked where the camera had been mounted, where the chair had rested, where the filing cabinet had stood. She closed the door behind her, breathed in the cool cedar scent of old wood and she had questions, so many of them, but only one mattered now. Not where was Charlie, but who had he been before? And why did everyone who got close to him start to question their own history? She turned on a small recorder, and spoke softly. "This is Special Agent Cassandra Lynn, inside the former shed of Charles Denslow. I believe the subject, if still alive, may be part of a larger network. I believe the transformations were not isolated, but intentional. I believe he may not have acted alone." She stopped. A noise. Outside. She walked to the window and looked out. A woman stood at the edge of the yard. Brown coat. Pale scarf. Her hands folded in front of her. She looked familiar. Genevieve. Cassandra opened the door and stepped out. The woman smiled faintly. "Are you the agent?" "Yes," Cassandra replied. "You work at the library?" The woman nodded. "I thought I should come. I found something." "What is it?" She opened her coat and pulled out a thin book. Handmade. Bound in fabric. The cover bore no title. Inside were pages filled with writing. Neat, looping script. It wasn't Charlie's. It was Genevieve's. But the entries didn't sound like her. They described other people. Moments she couldn't have witnessed. Places she'd never been. One entry read, "She will come here. She will ask questions, but she already knows the answers." Cassandra looked up sharply. Genevieve was gone. Not walked away. Gone. No footprints. No motion. Just empty yard. Just silence. Cassandra stood alone in the grass, the journal in her hands, her own name written on the next page. She read the line, "Cassandra L. High potential. Memory vulnerable. Proceed carefully." The handwriting was hers, but she had never written it. And far off, in the woods beyond the house, something moved. It took Cassandra Lynn several long minutes to move. She stood beneath the gray sky with the handmade journal clutched to her chest, her breath shallow, her hands trembling just slightly, not out of fear, but from something more primal, recognition, that whisper of intuition that said something had shifted, not in the world around her, but within her. She turned back toward the shed. The door creaked as it opened. The wood still smelled faintly of damp earth and varnish. It was almost clinical now, stripped bare of its horror. The chair was gone, the desk removed, but the essence of what had happened here remained like a stain in the grain of the wood. She sat down cross-legged in the center of the room, and opened the book again. Page after page described people she had never met, yet they all seemed familiar. Descriptions so specific. They felt pulled from someone's memory. Maybe her own. Maybe someone else's. It didn't matter. The names blurred. The timelines twisted. Until she found it. A passage dated 4 days prior. She will sit inside the room where it all began. She will read this journal and wonder who wrote it. She won't realize. Until she turns the page. Cassandra froze. Slowly she turned the page. It was blank. Then even more slowly. She reached for the pen clipped to the back cover. She didn't remember doing so. But it was already in her hand. She stared at the empty page. And wrote, "I am Cassandra Lynn. I am not sure what I remember anymore." The moment the words were on the paper, she felt something loosen in her chest. Like an old drawer sliding open after years of swelling wood and resistance. She closed the journal, got up, and left the shed for the last time. Back in Washington, the case was quietly archived. The FBI never closed it, but they no longer pursued it either. It had been reclassified under anomalous non-criminal occurrences. The phrase was a bureaucratic limbo. It meant we don't know what this is, and we don't want to admit it might matter. Cassandra returned to work, but not to the same job. She stepped away from field assignments, took a role in psychological profiling, paperwork, theory, safer things, but she kept the journal. She kept it locked in a fireproof safe in her home. She told herself she wouldn't read it again, but on quiet nights, she did. And slowly, a theory began to form. Not one she could publish. Not one she could even voice out loud. It wasn't just Charlie Denslow. It was the method. The garden shed wasn't the prison. It was the chrysalis. In Shelton Falls, the library underwent renovations. Genevieve was no longer employed there. Her disappearance was never formally investigated. No missing person report was filed. The mayor claimed she'd moved away. The library board said she left a letter of resignation, though no one ever saw it. But the archives room was changed. Shelves were taken down, the desk removed, the filing cabinets locked or emptied. Only one drawer remained untouched. In it a single index card. No name, just a symbol. A key, inside a circle, inside a triangle, and below it in faint pencil. "You are reading this because you were meant to."
2 years passed. In a quiet suburb outside Denver, a woman named Margaret Hall began attending a local support group for memory loss and identity confusion. She was only in her mid-40s, but she claimed to have large gaps in her past, entire years missing, memories out of order. She spoke softly, dressed in neutral colors. She carried a cloth-bound notebook, which she clutched even when she wasn't writing in it. One evening after the session, a fellow group member asked about the notebook. "Oh," Margaret said gently, "it's not mine. I just continue it." "Who wrote it?" Margaret smiled. "I think I did, but not all at once. Like a journal?" "No," she said, her voice almost too soft to hear, more like a file cabinet with no walls. She walked home that night under a pale crescent moon. Her street was quiet. Her front porch light flickered as she unlocked her door. Inside, everything was immaculate. No pictures on the walls, no clutter, just a small desk, a kettle on the stove, and on the far wall, a wooden filing cabinet, antique, worn at the handles. She placed her notebook beside it, pulled open the middle drawer. Inside were cards, labeled neatly, in a handwriting that seemed older than ink. She flipped through them, found one with the name Margaret H. She stared at it for a long time, then added a new one. Claire B. Memory recovering. Believes this is her first life. Monitor closely. She placed it in the drawer, closed it, and whispered, "Sleep well." In a government lab in Northern Virginia, Agent Cassandra Lynn stared at a corkboard. On it were photographs, lines of string, index cards, symbols, not for a case file, for herself, her own map. Each thread traced an event, a person, a missing date, and at the center of it all, a photograph. Charlie Denslow. No one had seen him since the day of the shed's discovery. There had been no confirmed sightings, no phone calls, no fingerprints, It was as if he had dissolved into the collective subconscious. But Cassandra didn't believe he was gone. She believed he had never really been one person to begin with. That the man called Charlie had been an identity adopted, passed on, reshaped, and made new again in each iteration. That there had never been a beginning or end to him. Only chapters, only files. On a fall morning, Cassandra received an unmarked envelope in her agency mailbox. Inside was a single item, a photograph. It showed a small bookstore in Maine. Nothing special. Hand-painted sign. Dusty windows. A help-wanted poster on the door. But in the far left corner of the image, behind the glass, was a man, tall, pale, slight tremor in his hand. She scanned it under every light spectrum. No manipulation. The photo was real. The man's face, not quite Charlie, but close. Cassandra flew out the same day. The store was gone, burned, just ashes. Locals said it had happened weeks earlier. An electrical fire. No one inside, except a man no one really knew, who had paid rent in cash and read old psychology books in the back room. The only item recovered from the rubble was a scorched index card, partially legible. Cassandra L. Integration successful. Awaiting replication. The following spring, a new library opened in a different state. Modern, bright, staffed with cheerful faces and community volunteers. One volunteer, in her late 30s, wore a name tag that read Lena. She was helpful, kind, a little forgetful. She liked working in the archive room best. Said it was quiet there, peaceful. One afternoon, a teenage girl came in with a question about filing systems. Lena smiled and said, "Well, it depends what you're trying to remember." The girl blinked. "I meant like Dewey Decimal." "Oh," Lena said. "Of course." The girl tilted her head. "Are you new here?" Lena paused, then smiled again. "I don't think so." That night, Lena returned to her small apartment, sat down at a wooden desk, opened a drawer. Inside, a stack of index cards.
She added a new one.
Jasmine M. Curious. Good memory. Dreams of forests. Observe. Then she closed the drawer, went to bed, and dreamed of a shed, where the tapes rewound themselves, and the people inside walked out smiling, whole again. And somewhere, in a place no one could find on any map, Charlie Denslow opened his eyes in a new body, and began again. It began with a broken lock. In the early morning hours of October 14th, 2012, a crisp autumn Sunday in the small town of Raven's Edge, Vermont, a neighbor noticed the front gate of the glass house slightly ajar. The house, perched at the edge of a forested ridge above Ross's River, had been vacant for nearly a month, ever since its owner, Dr. Evelyn Summers, announced she was relocating temporarily for sabbatical research. Most residents regarded the glass house as a regional landmark. Its minimalist design, floor-to-ceiling glass walls suspended above a shallow reflecting pond, made it both iconic and eerie in the fog. Dr. Summers had hosted weekend gatherings for local artists and academics over the years, praised for her gentle hospitality and precise conversation. She was well liked in a polite, reserved way, but neighbors had seen no movement in weeks. The autumn sun rose and the front gate stayed closed. Until that Sunday. Concerned Mrs. Fletcher across the street called the non-emergency line. When the local constable, Aaron Finch, arrived, he eased the gate open and called out. No answer. The front door, a sleek sliding panel, yielded easily to his push. Inside, the house lay silent, too silent. The floor was pristine, except where a single black boot print interrupted the dusty reflective floorboard just inside the threshold. Finch radioed additional officers. They began a methodical sweep. No furniture overturned. No signs of forced entry. Dr. Summers' car, an old but well-maintained Audi station wagon, still sat in the driveway. Then they found her. In the reflecting pond beneath the house, its glass floor cracked as if broken from within, floated her body. She lay face up in water dark with depth, her white blouse stained under it, her auburn hair drifting like seaweed in the steel blue dusk. Her eyes stared at the glass ceiling, fixed, silent. There was one more detail, a single black rose floating on her chest, a flower no one had seen in the house. No vases or petals in sight. It should have been straightforward. Dr. Summers had fallen, hit her head on the submerged rocks, and drowned. But something didn't add up. The glass floor had been shattered from a point inside the house, not outside. No one had called for help. And the rose, it felt deliberate. The investigation begins. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the back of her head, not consistent with slipping on glass. The crack radius around the break in the floor pointed toward a heavy impact from above, and the water in her lungs confirmed she had been alive when she hit the pond. The cause of death: homicide. Raven's Edge was shaken. Evelyn Summers had no known enemy. No public disputes. She'd been scheduled to resume work in 2 weeks, teaching part-time and completing research on regional folklore, particularly ghost stories about a river spirit called the Wraith of Robson's Ridge. Detective Lydia Burns was assigned to the case. She drove up to the house that afternoon, her steps slow on the wet wooden deck. She stared through the fractured glass at Evelyn's pale reflection staring back at her. A slow breath filled her lungs, and she began to see not just a crime scene, but a riddle. She noted every detail: the open front gate, the single boot print, the absence of a forced lock break, the black rose, and then the guest book, a small leather pad by the entrance, open to the last entry, October 1st, 2012. Thank you for welcoming me to your home. I look forward to our conversation next week. Signed, a visitor. It was unsigned by name, just a visitor, but Evelyn had dated it, and next week had come and gone. More troubling, several pages earlier, was a line: Green Friday, we spoke at midnight about lineage and reflection. Thank you. I will return. The phrase Green Friday was cryptic. Evelyn had scrawled a note beside it: invitation only. Lydia closed the guest book. No fingerprint smudges, no ink smears. It was pristine. The circle of guests: Detective Burns interviewed neighbors and town staff carefully. Evelyn had a small circle: PhD colleagues, visiting artists, occasional benefactors of her scholarship fund. One name consistently came up: Marcus Hale. He had visited the glass house several times in September. He taught folklore at a university in nearby Stowe. He and Evelyn met occasionally at symposiums and had lunch once, according to mutual acquaintances. Lydia found his name in the guest book, but that only took her to mid-September. After that, the entries were unsigned. Hale cooperated. He appeared shaken. He confirmed a late-night visit on September 29th, the date of Green Friday, but claimed they only discussed field journals and manuscript dates. She had walked him to his car around 11:45 p.m. He left. He saw no one else. He identified Amy Rosenberg, a graduate student assistant, who had stayed over for 2 nights in early October while transcribing recordings. Amy confirmed using the house and sleeping on a guest bed, but she insisted she left on October 3rd, well before the last entry. Amy's recollection was thoughtful but odd. She remembered lavender-scented soap on the sink and a single flower, a rose, placed on Evelyn's bedside table to ward off insects. She couldn't recall if it had been black, but she did remember pulling petals toward dusk, whispering something under her breath. Under her breath. The phrase chilled Lydia more than the autopsy results. The symbolic rose, something about the black rose, drew Lydia back to the house. It wasn't just decorative. There were no black rose plants on Evelyn's property. No florists in town stocked them. Black roses were dyed, impossibly rare. She researched. Most references to black roses turn up in Gothic literature, funerary symbolism, or tales of vengeful love. Evelyn was not the romantic, nor someone known to provoke such obsession, at least not publicly. Lydia checked regional florists and found shipments of black-dyed buds sent to other parts of Vermont and New Hampshire around November 2011 from an online boutique, but none to Raven's Edge. She began to suspect the black rose was a message, a signature, a mark, someone who believed in folklore or ritual. The guest book puzzle. Back at the station, Lydia compared guestbook entries with digital records. She found gaps, over 200 notations across several pages, but only digital records for about 20 visits. Evelyn maintained a lockbox with handwritten journals and signed pages, but much of it remained unsigned. Photos in town archives showed Evelyn sometimes alone, sometimes with small groups. One morning, Lydia found an unsigned entry with the same handwriting as the Green Friday entry, but dated several years earlier. January 7, 2007. The glass is just a mirror, one that shows what we are underneath. Thank you for sharing it. I saw me for a moment. It was the first entry to mention glass or reflection. Then she found another October 19, 2009. A companion stayed the night. We spoke of memory. She looked out and saw someone not there. The timeline spanned years. Strangers came, left, wrote nothing. Yet Evelyn remembered. Sometimes, the guest book was never fully signed, which suggested people intended to remain anonymous, or feared being identified. The first suspect, a stranger in reflection, Lydia, requested surveillance of local glass repair companies. Someone had to replace the fracture panel eventually. She found that after October 14th, Glass Tech of Burlington had removed the damaged panel. Cracks radiated. Photos of the removed section revealed an almost circular pattern from the inside. But no one in Glass Tech had ever heard of Evelyn Summers or the glass house until the call from a detective. Further inquiry into reflective surfaces led Lydia to an antiques dealer, Gwen Hart, whose shop stocked flat antique mirrors. A local historian once brought her a mirror found in the attic of the now demolished McKay boarding house in 1954. Gwen said she'd stored it in the back, an oblong pane with ornate etching and a large circular bubble where the glass had warped with age. She distinctly remembered the man's calm description of it. It's haunted, it shows things you don't expect. He had looked uneasy handling it. Records showed Gwen sold the mirror in 2003, possibly to someone in Vermont, but there was no invoice, no name, just a deposit record. Check #415 signed by ES for the full amount. ES, Evelyn Summers. So she had purchased that odd mirror, had installed it somewhere. Did she believe mirrors or glass could reflect the unseen? A pattern emerging. At the end of Part 1's discovery phase, Lydia sat in her car overlooking the river. The glass house reflected in the still water below. The broken glass, the unlikely rose, the guestbook entries, everything pointed to a ritualistic dimension. She began to suspect Evelyn's death wasn't simply murder. It was ceremonial, maybe even folkloric. The myth of the wraith that Evelyn studied, the river spirit that showed people their lost selves in water or glass. Lydia pulled her coat tighter. Her notebook lay open on her lap, filled with half-formed drawings of roses, glass shards, guestbook names underlined, dates circled in green. Late October in Vermont often brought fog. And fog held two things, obscurity and clarity. You could see shapes, but never the full face. Detective Lydia Burns stared through the glass walls of the house once more, her breath fogging the chill air. The reflecting pool beneath her remained drained, now just a stone basin with damp, mossy edges. The cracked glass floor had been removed and replaced with temporary plywood, robbing the space of its signature transparency. It was quiet, too quiet. Not just the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the kind that lingers in places touched by something unnatural. She couldn't shake the feeling that this house had seen more than a single murder. It had been watching something unravel for a long, long time. In Evelyn Summers' private study, she found journals precise, tidy, and unsettlingly abstract. They were less like diaries and more like field notes, cataloguing the behavior of guests like a scientist observing birds. Evelyn detailed mannerisms, emotional responses to certain words, and moments of silence. One passage in particular caught Lydia's attention. He only appeared in reflections. No sound, no pressure on the floor, but his silhouette always stood at the edge of the glass.
I never turned around quickly enough to see him directly. But he watched. And when he did, I found myself saying things I hadn't meant to say. Lydia's skin prickled. This was not paranoia. Evelyn was meticulous. Her mind was sharp and scholarly. If she wrote it, it meant she had seen it, or believed it with full conviction. And Evelyn had never been known to suffer from delusions. Lydia made a note in her pad. Who is the silhouette? The missing year. Lydia needed a timeline, something to ground the surreal narrative taking shape. Evelyn Summers had taken a sabbatical in 2006, and again in 2011. Both times she had left town without leaving much detail, just vague mentions of field study or archival travel, but university payroll records showed she never claimed travel reimbursement. No hotel stays, no flights. Her bank activity during those periods was local: groceries, gas, hardware store visits. So where had she gone? A clerk at the town's storage facility finally gave her something. Yes, she rented a unit, out past lot 14. I remember it because she asked for one that got no direct sunlight. Inside the rented storage unit, paid monthly, still active even after Evelyn's death, Lydia found boxes marked with years, not contents. 2004, 2006, 2009, 2011, carefully labeled, tightly packed. She opened the one marked 2006. Inside were cassette tapes. Dozens, each labeled with a single date and a time range. No subject matter listed. She brought a few to the station and borrowed an old player from evidence storage. The first tape, dated July 19, 2006, began with the faint whirring sound of a field recorder, followed by Evelyn's voice. Subject is late again. They said midnight, but I've learned it rarely arrives on time. It shows up when it's ready. I've set mirrors on all 4 walls. I've left the flower near the door. Tonight I won't speak first. There was silence, then a sound like shifting fabric, and finally, in a voice not Evelyn's, but soft and slightly distorted, came a reply. You remember more this time. Then the tape cut off. Lydia leaned back in her chair. Her heart thudded with the rhythmic tension of something half explained. These weren't just field tapes. Evelyn had been recording interactions with someone, or something. She skipped to the next tape. More silence. Then her own voice again. Why do you come through the mirror? And the reply. Because doors are too easily locked. The folklore becomes real. Evelyn's academic specialty in regional folklore had never raised eyebrows. In fact, many towns in Vermont considered it quaint, harmless. Every region had its ghost stories. Most professors filed them under cultural memory or storytelling traditions. But Evelyn had published something obscure in 2008, under a pseudonym, Elena Rowe. Lydia found it through university archives, while cross-referencing author aliases. The paper was titled Reflections of the Lost Self, Mirrors in River Spirit Mythology. The abstract was dry enough, but buried deep within, it described several case studies, in which mirrors were associated with phenomena involving unexplained deaths, vanishing persons, or identity confusion. One account described a woman in 1891 who claimed her reflection no longer followed her movements. Days later, she was found dead near a pond with a single white lily placed on her chest. A symbol, a calling card, much like Evelyn's black rose. One passage stood out. The folkloric wraith of the ridges appears not as an external being, but as a reflection of the witness's hidden fears or unacknowledged truths. To look into its eyes is to forget your name, or worse, remember the name that was never truly yours. That passage rattled Lydia more than she expected. What did it mean to remember a name that wasn't yours? Could Evelyn have been experimenting with some kind of psychological ritual, trying to summon a response from the subconscious mind? Or was she in contact with someone whose identity couldn't be fully known? And if so, had she invited them too far in? An unexpected lead. The investigation was already complex, when a call came in from a nearby town, Newcastle, about 40 miles north. A librarian named Dana Renfield had been cataloguing donations from a private estate when she discovered a guest book almost identical to Evelyn's. Same cover, same formatting, same ink, she told Lydia over the phone. And inside, there's a familiar entry. Lydia drove up immediately. The book belonged to a man named Vincent Rice, a former folklore researcher who had died of a stroke in 2016. No one had gone through his estate carefully, but inside the book, page after page matched Evelyn's guest book, same ink, same strange phrasing. And once again, an anonymous entry, "I saw me, but it wasn't my face." Another entry read, "The mirror cracked last night. Just a hairline, but now I don't sleep near it. I see her sometimes, standing where I should be." Lydia was silent. Dana, the librarian, noticed her expression. "There's one more thing," Dana said quietly. "There's a mirror in storage. Ornate, heavy, no paperwork, but it was found face down in Vincent's attic." They retrieved it together, and Lydia froze. It was the same mirror Gwen Hart had described, the warped oval with the etched frame, the mirror Evelyn had allegedly bought in 2003. But if this mirror was here, then what had Evelyn brought into the glass house? Or worse, had she ever received the original at all? Had someone else taken it and brought it to her years later? Someone who had been to Vincent's house, someone who may have left that guest book entry in 1999, someone who now stood in Evelyn's reflecting pool, leaving behind a single black rose. The disappearance a week after Lydia's visit to Newcastle. Another name surfaced, Jasper Langley, a former student of Evelyn's in 2005. He had vanished in 2007, last seen leaving her seminar with a leather-bound journal clutched in one hand. No one reported him missing immediately. He was an adult, known to travel, but Evelyn had written about him in her notes. Jasper showed real promise. He asked about the veil between stories and truth. When I warned him not to experiment with the rituals without supervision, he told me, "I don't need a guide to find myself." His guest book entry was the last before I burned that journal. I fear he went too far. There was no journal among Evelyn's belongings, but Jasper's name was scratched out violently in the guest book, the paper nearly torn through, a circle drawn over it, a large X. Lydia couldn't be sure what had happened to Jasper, but the implications were disturbing. Was Evelyn trying to protect others from what she'd found, or had she become the custodian of something she could no longer control? The symbolism was no longer abstract. It was personal. People had touched something they shouldn't have, and disappeared, or died. The silent witness with Evelyn gone. The mirror found in Newcastle was brought into evidence. Lydia arranged for forensic specialists to examine it. No fingerprints, no blood, no signs of tampering, but when the photography team tried to capture its image, something unusual occurred. On several frames, a faint silhouette appeared in the glass. It did not match anyone present in the room. It had no facial features, just a tall outline, slightly warped, as if pulled from deep water. They assumed it was a camera flare, until one technician, reviewing the digital files alone that night, quit the next morning without explanation. Lydia tried to dismiss it. Maybe he was simply unnerved. But the mirror remained in its crate, and no one volunteered to open it again. The mirror sat in an evidence locker, shrouded in grey canvas and sealed with a heavy warning label, "Do not open without authorization." Most officers passed it by without a glance, pretending they didn't know the story behind it. Some believed it was just a piece of folklore, quirky, creepy, sure, but ultimately harmless. Others, particularly those who had been in the room when the photos were taken, avoided even the aisle it rested in. Detective Lydia Burns had never been superstitious, but in recent weeks, she'd found herself checking her own reflection more often than usual, not out of vanity, but for reassurance, to be sure it was still hers. She'd started dreaming of glass. In those dreams, the sound of footsteps echoed across tile floors that shimmered like water. She would turn toward the source, heart pounding, only to find herself standing in front of a mirror with no reflection staring back. When she awoke, she always felt something was missing. A memory, a thought, a part of her name. But she pressed on. The old guest on a cold afternoon in November. Lydia received a call from a care facility in upstate Vermont. The nurse, a man named Thomas Green, had found her contact through a college alumni database. One of their long-term patients had scribbled Evelyn Summers' name in a notebook. The patient was mute, non-verbal for over a decade, but lucid. According to Green, he showed agitation when Evelyn's photo was presented. His name was Leland Voss, former professor of comparative folklore, retired in 1994. His career had ended quietly, but he had been a mentor to many, including, it turned out, Vincent Reyes, the man who had owned the second guest book. When Lydia visited, Voss was seated in a sunlit room overlooking a bare winter field. His thin hands trembled slightly as he sketched with a pencil, nothing detailed, just geometric shapes and dark shadows. A nurse wheeled Lydia in and placed a printout of Evelyn Summers' university portrait in front of him. He froze. Then very slowly, he turned the picture face down. "She used to write to him," Green whispered. He never responded, but after her letters stopped coming, he drew that shape over and over again. He handed Lydia a separate page from Voss's notebook, a long oval shape, clearly a mirror. Inside it, a single figure, no face, only a circle where the head would be. Below it, 2 words had been scrawled with forceful precision. "You first." The basement plan. There were no leads left to chase, at least not in the conventional sense. Lydia returned to Evelyn's house, now sealed under temporary custody, pending decisions from the late professor's estate lawyer. But the crime scene had been cleared, the furniture left in place, and the reflecting pool now fully boarded. She let herself in. In Evelyn's last letter, found in a sealed envelope tucked inside one of the journals, she had written something cryptic. "If I ever fail to return, don't look for the door. Look beneath the floor." Lydia had always assumed it meant metaphorically, but now, alone in the silent house, she walked carefully across the reflective tiles and stopped at the center of the pool. The glass had once been fitted seamlessly between stone edges, forming a transparent floor over shallow water. Now it was plywood, cheap, temporary, but as she knelt, tapping on the surface, she heard a hollow echo in one section, different from the others. She pried it up. Beneath the floor, hidden in the cavity under the reflecting pool, was a trapdoor, carefully integrated into the design, almost imperceptible, unless you knew where to look. She hesitated, but then lifted it. A steel ladder descended into darkness. The mirror room, what Lydia found beneath the glass house, was not a storage space. It was something else entirely. The basement chamber was circular, the walls lined with shelves of notebooks, old tape reels, and objects wrapped in cloth. But dominating the space was a mirror, the real mirror, unlike the one stored in the evidence locker. This one was intact, pristine. Its oval frame bore intricate etchings, symbols that resembled Norse runes and mathematical glyphs intertwined. It sat on a stand, angled slightly toward the entrance. A black rose, fresh, rested at its base. Lydia froze. This house had been closed off for weeks. No one had been inside. Yet the flower had not wilted. She stepped forward cautiously. The reflection in the mirror showed the room clearly. Her own face, the shelves, the exit ladder behind her, but nothing else, until she turned slightly away and caught it. Just for a moment, a flicker of movement behind her reflection. A second shadow, not mimicking her posture. Something taller, still, waiting. She spun around. The room was empty. When she looked back, the reflection was normal. She wanted to leave. Every nerve in her body told her to leave. But Evelyn had died for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was rooted here. The recording on a table near the mirror. She found a final cassette recorder. It had a fresh tape loaded, and Evelyn's voice was already present at the beginning. I've accepted I won't win against it, but I want someone to understand. The mirror doesn't show what is, it shows what was almost what could have been. It remembers versions of us that never came to pass. That's why people see others in it, or themselves with different eyes. It's not a haunting, it's a proposition. I invited it in because I thought I could study it. But it's not something that wants to be known, it wants to become. If it takes me, don't try to follow. It already knows your name. There was a pause, then a voice, not hers, murmured, you speak well, better than the others, but you're still only one version. The tape ended. Lydia stared at the machine. So many questions, none with answers. She gathered the tape and backed away from the mirror. As she ascended the ladder and replaced the plywood, she sealed the space shut. Not permanently, but enough. The twist 2 days later. The mirror in evidence storage, shattered without explanation. No signs of tampering, no physical intrusion. The glass had broken inward, as if from pressure behind the reflection. Lydia reviewed the security footage, personally. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the camera facing the evidence locker glitched. When it resumed 10 seconds later, the mirror was shattered, its pieces forming a near-perfect circle around the black velvet crate. In the very center lay a single black rose, still fresh, and next to it, a card. Old, warm, handwritten in delicate script. It read, "You weren't first, but you might be last." The broken mirror had been sealed in a containment vault in the lower levels of the evidence facility. The shards swept into thick plastic evidence bags with trembling hands. No officer wanted to be near it, and no one could explain the black rose, or the card. Detective Lydia Burns, now looking visibly thinner, and far more haunted than when the investigation began, sat in her apartment that evening, with Evelyn's final tape, still playing in her mind. The voice on the recording hadn't been Evelyn's at the end. It had been something else, something older perhaps. Not angry, not even threatening, but confident, like it knew something no one else did. Something inevitable. She had tried to tell herself it was a hoax, that maybe Evelyn had been psychologically unwell, that mirrors could be metaphors, that black roses could be planted, that cards could be forged. But in the silence of her own home, surrounded by years of rational police work and logical deduction, Lydia had finally stopped pretending. She had seen it, the figure in the mirror, not just once, and now, she saw it in every pane of glass, in every turned-off TV screen, in the window of her car, just before she opened the door, always still, never quite copying her, like a version of herself, or someone else entirely, who was waiting for something to shift. A visitor. In the reflection 2 weeks passed, and the case was marked unresolved, closed pending new evidence. The glass house sat abandoned again, though the basement door remained nailed shut under Lydia's personal request. Evelyn's journals had been transferred to an academic archive, but Lydia had kept one page, the final guest list, the one that included her own name. She hadn't signed it, of course, but there it was, at the bottom of the page, in the same handwriting as all the others. Lydia Burns, August 12th, the 3:12 a.m., that time again. The exact time the mirror shattered in storage. The exact time the camera had glitched. And August 12th. It was still a week away. She began watching her apartment more carefully, checking doors, locking windows, leaving small pieces of paper in front of her closet and bathroom mirror to see if they'd been moved. 3 nights before the date, she woke to find her bedroom door open. The paper had been stepped over, but there were no footprints. The truth: she found Lydia returned to Evelyn's house just after dusk, the night before August 12th. She used her own tools to quietly remove the plywood and unseal the trapdoor. She didn't alert the department, nor log the visit. If something was going to happen, she couldn't involve anyone else. With a flashlight and Evelyn's final tape in her pocket, she climbed down the ladder into the mirror chamber for what she thought would be the last time. The room hadn't changed, but the mirror had. It was no longer empty. The reflection showed Lydia as she was. Same clothes, same face, but the expression was different. The mirrored Lydia wasn't afraid. She looked calm, confident, older, maybe by a few years. A thin scar ran down the right side of her forehead, and a black rose was pinned just above her heart. And then, very subtly, the mirrored Lydia raised her hand. Lydia hadn't moved. Her reflection was waving first. She stared. Was this the twist Evelyn had feared? Not death, not madness, but replacement. The decision she didn't run. Instead, Lydia stepped closer, until she was just inches from the glass. Her breath fogged slightly, though the room wasn't cold. The reflection watched her with something like curiosity, or maybe pity. Then it mouthed a word. Soon, the light bulb overhead flickered. The mirror vibrated gently, like a tuning fork touched by a whisper. Lydia backed away. She placed Evelyn's tape recorder on the table beside the mirror, and pressed record. "This is Detective Lydia Burns," she said, voice steady, "and if this is found, I want it noted that I don't know what this is, but it's real. This mirror is not an object. It's a threshold." She paused. "It doesn't want to harm. It wants to choose. Or maybe to reflect what could be. If we let it. Evelyn Summers let it. I won't." She switched off the recorder. Then slowly, she turned and left the basement. She resealed the trapdoor. This time, she covered it with cement.
The final guest. On August 12th, at exactly 3:12 a.m., Lydia woke up in her bed. At first, everything felt normal, until she stood in the hallway and saw her reflection in the hall mirror. Her clothes were the same, her face the same, but the scar was there. A small, healed line down the right side of her forehead, and the black rose. It sat in a vase on her kitchen counter, fresh. She turned slowly toward it. There had been no roses in her apartment the night before. She had locked the door, shut every window, and on the guest list she had kept, where her name had already appeared, there was now a check mark beside it. She hadn't made it. What remains? Lydia never returned to the glass house. She left the force 2 months later and took up a quiet job cataloguing old case files in a state archive. She no longer pursued active investigations. She said little, slept even less. Her co-workers noted she was kind, compassionate, but distant, like someone not quite in step with the world around her. Once, an intern asked her what case had made her leave detective work. Lydia had smiled faintly and answered, "It wasn't a case, it was a guest." When asked to explain, she only said, "We all invite something in, we just don't realize it." The mirror's future: years later, a contractor bought the glass house at auction, unaware of its history. The structure had decayed slightly, but its design was still praised by architecture blogs. The new owner planned to renovate the reflecting pool, reinstall the glass, and repurpose the house as a luxury retreat. But when the renovation team lifted the boards covering the central tiles, they found the subfloor unusually dense. When they dug further, they struck the trap door, cement-filled, but with a faint outline. They broke through and found the chamber beneath. The mirror had been removed. No record indicated where it went, but the guest book remained. Its last page contained only one new entry. Welcome back. August 12th, 3:12 a.m. No signature. Just a black rose pressed between the pages. The town of West Valley City, Utah, had always kept a quiet rhythm. Not far from Salt Lake City, its wide suburban streets and simple homes sat tucked beneath snow-dusted mountains, offering the kind of predictable comfort that rarely made the news. That calm would shatter, piece by piece, when a young woman named Susan Cox Powell vanished from her home on a cold December morning in 2009. At first, it seemed like a tragic anomaly. Then, over time, it unraveled into something darker, something that whispered of obsession, family secrets, and a horrifying betrayal that no one could have seen coming. Susan Cox Powell was just 28 years old when she vanished. By all outward appearances, she lived a normal suburban life. She was married to Josh Powell, and together they were raising two sons, Charlie and Braden, who were 4 and 2 years old at the time. Friends and neighbors would often see Susan tending to her garden or walking the children through the neighborhood. She had a soft voice, a trusting nature, and a deep love for her boys. But behind the walls of the Powell home, something was off, something quietly wrong. It wasn't obvious at first. Susan, after all, was careful. She was practical, composed, and knew how to put on a smile when needed. But as her marriage with Josh deteriorated over the years, cracks began to show. Josh had grown increasingly controlling. He monitored their finances obsessively, made it difficult for Susan to see her friends, and restricted her access to money. Susan worked as a stockbroker, while Josh bounced from one business scheme to another, often sinking their limited resources into ventures that never panned out. Susan became the sole breadwinner, and Josh grew more bitter. Those closest to Susan began to notice signs of emotional and psychological abuse. Friends recalled her subtle but telling comments, how she wasn't allowed to use the car without permission, how Josh had taken out a life insurance policy on her, and how she had started hiding a secret journal, documenting her fears. The journal was the kind of thing a person creates when they believe something terrible might happen. In it, she described Josh's erratic behavior and her growing concern for her safety. At one point, she wrote that if anything happened to her, people should look at Josh. Susan made preparations, subtle, quiet ones. She created a secret will and placed it in a safety deposit box. She even recorded a video inventory of their possessions, narrating over the footage in a tone that was calm but pointed. It was her way of leaving breadcrumbs in case she disappeared. She wasn't planning to run, she was planning for the worst. On December 6, 2009, Susan stayed home from church because she wasn't feeling well. Later that afternoon, a neighbor visited and noted that everything seemed normal. The next day, Susan didn't show up for work. Her daycare provider, who had expected the children, also became worried. It wasn't like Susan to simply vanish without a word. When police were contacted and arrived at the Powell home, they found it locked. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, just a strangely empty house. Later that day, Josh returned home with his two sons. He told police that he had taken them on a spontaneous camping trip to the Utah desert at midnight, in the middle of a snowstorm. When asked why he would take toddlers out in freezing conditions on a school night, Josh's explanation was flat and unnerving. He claimed he simply thought it would be fun. The police, immediately suspicious, searched the van he had driven. They found traces of Susan's blood on the floor. They also discovered a fan blowing on a wet spot on the carpet inside the house. Something had been cleaned. Susan's friends were quick to speak out. They told investigators about Josh's odd behavior, about Susan's fears, about the journals and warnings. Her co-workers confirmed she hadn't been seen since the afternoon of December 6th, and while the circumstantial evidence mounted, no body was found. Josh maintained his innocence, refused to cooperate further with police, and soon hired a lawyer. He also packed up and moved to Washington State, taking Charlie and Braden with him. As weeks passed, the investigation stalled. There was no hard evidence tying Josh to a murder, no body to confirm a crime, no eyewitnesses, no confession, but public suspicion never faded. In Washington, Josh moved in with his father, Stephen Powell, a man whose role in the case would grow increasingly disturbing. Stephen Powell was no ordinary grandfather. Investigators soon discovered that he had an unhealthy fixation on Susan. Diaries, videos and hundreds of photographs were found showing Stephen had secretly recorded her, stolen her personal items, and even written extensively about his sexual obsession with her. He had harbored fantasies that Susan was romantically interested in him, though there was no evidence to support this. Susan, in fact, had told friends she was deeply uncomfortable around Stephen. When police raided Stephen Powell's home in 2011, they found the disturbing evidence and arrested him, not for Susan's disappearance, but for voyeurism and possession of child pornography. The materials found were so extensive that Stephen was sentenced to prison. While this offered some justice, the search for Susan remained stalled. Her children, still in Josh's custody, were described as withdrawn and troubled. Charlie, the older of the two, began to say unsettling things, mentioning that Mommy was in the trunk, and Mommy went with us but didn't come back. In 2012, child custody was transferred temporarily to Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, due to the growing concerns about Josh's stability. He was ordered to undergo a psychological evaluation and comply with supervised visitation if he wanted to see his sons. Josh agreed. On February 5, 2012, a social worker arrived at his house in Graham, Washington, with the children for a scheduled visit. What happened next was something no one could have imagined. As soon as the children entered the house, Josh slammed the door in the social worker's face. She frantically called 911, reporting that she feared for the boys' safety. But by the time authorities arrived, it was too late. Josh had locked the doors, doused the house in gasoline and set it ablaze, killing himself, Charlie and Braden in a horrific murder-suicide. The house exploded in a fireball, ending 3 lives in a single final act of destruction. Investigators later discovered that Josh had planned the act meticulously. He had emptied his bank accounts, donated the boys' toys to charity, and left disturbing messages in emails suggesting he couldn't live without them. He also left behind a voicemail for family members, saying simply, "I'm sorry, goodbye." The death of Josh and the 2 boys was a blow that echoed far beyond the family. For Susan's parents, it was a loss layered on top of another, their daughter still missing, presumed dead, and now her children also gone. The public reacted with horror and grief. How had this happened? How had signs been missed? Why hadn't Josh been stopped? To this day, Susan's body has never been found. No charges were ever filed against Josh while he was alive. Her case remains technically unsolved, though few doubt what happened. She likely died on December 6, 2009 in her own home, at the hands of her husband, who later destroyed everything that remained of her legacy. Yet, the story lingers in America's memory, not just as a crime, but as a haunting portrait of control, fear and the invisible battles so many endure behind closed doors. After the fire, after the screams faded, and the blackened debris cooled under a grey Washington sky, investigators were left with silence and devastation. The house was gone, Josh Powell was gone, and with him, any remaining hope that he might someday tell the truth about what had happened to Susan. The aftermath was not only heartbreaking, it was maddening. It was as though Josh had pulled the curtain down on the story just before its final act. No confession, no note revealing where he had left Susan's body, no clear acknowledgement of guilt, just silence, and the grief of 2 families now linked forever by loss. In West Valley City, detectives returned once again to the evidence they had. It wasn't much, at least not by legal standards. The van Josh had used on the night of Susan's disappearance had shown traces of her blood. The carpet inside the home had been recently cleaned, suspiciously so, and there was Susan's own voice, echoing through time in her journals and videos, expressing fear, preparing for the worst. But with no physical remains, prosecutors had always hesitated. The law, after all, demands certainty. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, were left not just with the weight of their daughter's loss, but with the unbearable fact that they had almost saved her children. The custody battle had been long and agonizing. They had fought tirelessly to gain visitation rights, then custody,
and then to protect their grandsons from Josh. When they finally succeeded in removing the boys from his full-time care, it had been too late. Josh's final act had stolen everything from them. Even in the midst of their grief, Chuck and Judy continued to advocate for answers. They worked to push Susan's story back into the spotlight, to remind the world that she was still missing. They spoke to news outlets, met with lawmakers, and created foundations in her name, and through it all, they waited hoping that somewhere, someday, someone might find the place where Susan had been left. Meanwhile, investigators took a closer look at Stephen Powell, Josh's father, who was still serving time in prison for the voyeurism and child pornography charges. He had always been a strange, disturbing presence in the case, a man who had developed a twisted infatuation with his daughter-in-law, and had catalogued her life obsessively. Diaries, photographs, video recordings, all secretly taken, many in Susan's most private moments. Some believed that Stephen had known more than he ever let on. There were theories. Some speculated that Josh had confided in his father about the crime. Others wondered if Stephen had helped him cover it up. But despite the deeply unsettling nature of Stephen's behavior, there was no direct evidence tying him to Susan's disappearance. When he was eventually released from prison in 2017, he slipped quietly back into the world. He died the following year of natural causes, taking with him whatever secrets he might have held. Years passed, and still, the case hovered in a strange, painful limbo. No resolution, no remains, no closure, but Susan's story would not be forgotten. Journalists, investigators and armchair detectives continued to revisit the case, combing through old files, retracing Josh's steps, and looking for patterns. In 2019, cadaver dogs were brought to a mine shaft in Utah's West Desert, an area Josh had reportedly visited around the time of Susan's disappearance. The terrain was rugged and remote, full of abandoned mine shafts and cave-ins, places difficult to search, and even harder to access safely. Some believed it was the perfect place to hide something meant never to be found, but the search yielded nothing conclusive. A scent here, a trace there, hints perhaps, but no body, no bones, no definitive proof. And so the story remained one of the most haunting unsolved cases in modern American memory, not for its lack of suspects, but for its lack of evidence. What made it all the more chilling was how ordinary it had all seemed, right up until it wasn't. Susan had been a devoted mother, a responsible employee, a kind friend. Josh had been strange, yes, but quiet, controlling but not overtly violent in a way that drew attention. Their house had been a normal house. Their family from the outside looked like any other. But that's the thing about quiet houses and ordinary lives. Sometimes, they hide the most dangerous storms. In the years since Susan's disappearance, and the deaths of Charlie and Braden, much has been learned, not just about the Powell family, but about the warning signs of coercive control, emotional abuse, and the hidden dynamics that can exist in relationships that appear stable. Susan's story has become a touchstone for domestic violence advocates, investigators, and legal scholars. It showed how a person could be in danger even when no bruises were visible, how someone could cry for help in ways that weren't always heard. Her case also prompted changes to visitation and custody protocols. The fact that Josh had been allowed unsupervised access to his children, even temporarily, after so many red flags were raised, sparked outrage. Lawmakers in Washington state and across the country began pushing for reforms, ensuring that child welfare agencies were better trained to recognize not just physical danger, but emotional manipulation, psychological control, and the long-term effects of abuse. There were other questions too, unanswered ones that lingered quietly in the background. If the police had acted sooner, could they have prevented the murders of Charlie and Braden? Could Josh have been charged earlier? Based on the circumstantial evidence, could Susan's remains have been found if different leads had been followed? These questions have no easy answers. They are the sort that settle heavily in the chest, the kind that drift into silence and never fully leave. For Chuck and Judy Cox, the pain became a kind of mission. They turned their grief into advocacy, speaking out about domestic violence, coercive abuse, and the need to listen when someone says they are afraid. They held vigils, created memorials, and never stopped searching. Not for Susan, not for the truth, and not for meaning in the senseless. Sometimes, in their public statements, they would recall the sound of their daughter's voice, how she used to sing lullabies to her boys, how she lit up when she talked about them, how strong she had tried to be, right up until the end. And sometimes, they would read from her journals, the quiet, desperate warnings she left behind. Those words, written in fear, became the clearest testimony of all. "I don't trust him," she had written once. "If something happens to me, look at Josh. I'm not suicidal, I'm happy with my life. I just want my children to be safe." It was a message she had buried quietly, hoping someone might find it. And they did. Years later, that journal became more than just a record of fear. It became a voice that refused to be silenced. A voice that called out from the void, and demanded to be heard. Though Susan's body remains undiscovered, her story has become a kind of ghost, one that drifts through the collective memory, reminding people to pay attention to the quiet signs, the silent suffering, the red flags that flicker behind closed doors. In many ways, the real tragedy of Susan's story isn't just that she vanished, it's that she tried so hard to be heard. And yet the warning came too late. The years following the tragedy felt suspended, as if time itself refused to move forward until justice had been served. Yet as seasons changed and headlines faded, the unanswered questions surrounding Susan's disappearance remained a persistent echo, quiet but unrelenting. Back in West Valley City, Utah, the lead investigators had never truly closed the case. Although Josh Powell was gone, and the two innocent lives of Charlie and Braden had been claimed in an act of calculated finality, the search for Susan's body continued. For the detectives who had worked the case from the beginning, it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about dignity. It was about bringing Susan home. One of those detectives, Ellis Maxwell, had carried Susan's case for years. In interviews, he often admitted how deeply it had affected him, not just professionally, but personally. He had been in Susan and Josh's home. He had sat across from Josh, questioned him, watched his eyes as he dodged and deflected. The suspicion had always been there, but the law required more than instinct, more than gut feelings. It required evidence. And that evidence, despite every search warrant and forensic analysis, had remained just beyond their grasp. That didn't mean they stopped looking. Over time, they pursued every theory. They combed over maps of the Utah desert, studied satellite imagery, reviewed GPS pings, and tracked down the smallest leads. There were searches in abandoned mines, wells and remote wilderness areas Josh might have known, search and rescue teams, cadaver dogs, and even amateur volunteers took part in the hunt. But the landscape was vast, and time had buried its secrets deep. Despite the lack of resolution, Susan's memory remained a powerful force. Her face, framed with soft brown hair and a hopeful smile, still appeared on missing persons posters, in news documentaries, and in vigils held by loved ones. She was never allowed to become a footnote. What haunted so many was how close Susan had come to escaping. In the months before her disappearance, she had made it known, quietly but clearly, that she feared for her life. She had told friends. She had documented her experiences in private writings. She had even recorded videos of her possessions, indicating that if anything happened to her, people should know what was missing. But for all of her courage, she had also faced enormous pressure. Like many women in abusive or controlling relationships, she had found herself trapped, not just physically, but emotionally, financially, socially. Her efforts to leave were met with resistance. Josh controlled the finances, the cars, even their social life. Susan, like so many others in her position, had been made to feel powerless. And yet she kept fighting. That strength is what her family, and especially her father Chuck, wanted the world to remember. Not the mystery, not the headlines, but the woman, the mother, the daughter, the one who had tried. The Powell family dynamics were endlessly examined in the years after the tragedy. Josh's upbringing, particularly under his father Stephen, was scrutinized for signs of dysfunction, entitlement and control. Stephen Powell had exhibited disturbing behaviors, his obsession with Susan, his voyeurism, his carefully organized troves of photographs and videos. The question lingered. Had Josh learned his twisted sense of relationships from the man who raised him? Psychologists and criminal profilers weighed in. They noted the patterns, the entitlement, the manipulation, the secrecy. Josh had shown early signs of narcissistic and controlling behavior. He believed he owned Susan, not that he was her partner. That belief, that she was his to control, even his to destroy, was what made him so dangerous. By the time Susan tried to leave, it may have already been too late. The weeks leading up to her disappearance, as quiet as they seemed on the surface, were filled with tension. Susan had begun talking more openly to friends about her plans. She wanted to leave. She wanted safety for herself and her children. She wanted something better. And Josh, he must have sensed that. Some believe it was that growing independence that triggered his final decision. If Susan left him, he would lose everything. The control, the power, the image. For a man like Josh, that wasn't just rejection, it was annihilation. That's why, when the Sunday she disappeared came around, the events felt premeditated. The supposed late-night camping trip in freezing weather, the carefully controlled answers to police, the inexplicably cleaned house. It all pointed to one conclusion. He had planned this. He had waited for the right moment. When the boys were asleep and Susan was alone, he had known where he would go, what he would do, how he would cover his tracks. But there had been cracks in his plan. He hadn't counted on Susan's co-workers reporting her missing so quickly. He hadn't expected the police to search the house and notice the wet spot on the carpet, the fans, the missing couch, and he hadn't predicted that public suspicion would fall on him so swiftly. Still, he had managed to evade justice. Somehow, despite the growing pile of circumstantial evidence, the legal system couldn't reach him, not in time. And then came the final act, the fire, a final escape, a final control. It was this act that most disturbed those who had once hoped for reconciliation, that he could take the lives of his own children, innocent boys who loved him, who didn't understand the danger they were in, was a level of cruelty few could comprehend. Investigators later found the details chilling. Josh had purchased a can of gasoline and sent final emails. He had given away the boys' toys, cleaned out his files, and locked the door from the inside. The fire was not an act of passion, it was a final cold calculation. And yet, even in death, he didn't answer the questions. Where was Susan? The truth remains buried, perhaps in a desert grave, perhaps in a forgotten shaft, perhaps in a place only Josh knew. Without a confession, and without physical evidence, her family continues to live in a state of suspended grief. In the years that followed, the Susan Cox Powell case became a case study in missed warnings. Domestic violence experts pointed to it as an example of why emotional and psychological abuse must be taken seriously. Legal scholars used it to highlight the need for reform in custody proceedings, and journalists revisited it time and again, trying to piece together what might have happened, and how it might have been prevented. The public, too, seemed unwilling to let it go. Documentaries, podcasts and articles kept the story alive, not for the sake of sensationalism, but because it touched something deeper, a collective recognition of vulnerability, of silence, of how fragile a life can be when the systems designed to protect it fall short. For Susan's parents, the years without answers have not dulled the pain, but they have brought a kind of purpose. The Susan Cox Powell Foundation, established in her name, works to educate the public about signs of domestic abuse and to support families facing similar struggles. Through this work, Susan's voice continues to echo, not just in courtrooms or search efforts, but in classrooms, workshops, and support groups. What remains is a haunting quiet, a case still officially open, a life still technically missing, a family still waiting, but also a legacy. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of human behavior, there can be strength, there can be resistance, and there can be hope, not just for answers, but for change. In the shadow of so much tragedy, Susan's story continued to grow, not in volume, but in depth. People who had never met her spoke her name with quiet reverence. Her disappearance had become one of those rare cases that seemed to live on through layers of public grief, outrage, and deep sadness. But within her family, and among those who knew her personally, Susan was more than a case. She was a whole person, and her memory lived not in headlines, but in the spaces she used to occupy. At her parents' home in Washington, photos still lined the mantel, smiling pictures of Susan holding baby Charlie, another with Braden on her lap, both boys giggling, her arms wrapped protectively around them. These weren't the images used by the media. These were private glimpses of everyday motherhood, captured without pretense. It was those moments that Chuck and Judy Cox clung to, the rhythm of Susan's voice, the way she hummed while folding laundry, the strength she tried to project even when she felt the walls closing in around her. After Josh Powell's final act, the murder-suicide that took the lives of Charlie and Braden, an eerie silence seemed to settle over the investigation. There were no more interviews with Josh, no more court dates, no last-minute revelations. The man at the center of the storm had removed himself, and the two boys who might have eventually told the truth were gone with him. But for investigators, closure remained elusive. Back in Utah, the West Valley City Police Department officially closed Susan's case in 2013, 3 years after her disappearance. Though many believed they had solved the mystery in theory, in practice, there remained a heavy burden. Susan's body had never been found. Without that final piece, the story could never fully rest. Over the years, detectives had combed over every tip, every lead. The rugged landscapes of Utah had been searched, often with nothing more than a hunch and a prayer. Abandoned mines were explored, desert washes sifted through. Teams with dogs trained to detect human remains spent days trekking across unforgiving terrain. Sometimes, they found bones, but never hers. And each time, the news would briefly surge again, bringing renewed hope followed quickly by quiet disappointment. Despite the setbacks, the Powell case left an indelible mark on the legal and social landscape. It served as a catalyst for important conversations, especially around domestic violence, custody battles, and the challenges victims face in seeking help when the abuse is not physical. Susan's case highlighted how isolation, manipulation, and financial control can become invisible shackles. In the court of public opinion, Josh Powell had already been tried and convicted, but in the legal realm, he had slipped through every crack. There had been red flags, dozens of them, from his disturbing responses during questioning, to his father's obsessive behavior, from Susan's own documented fears, to the boys' subtle childlike revelations during their brief time in protective custody. But none of it had been enough. Not in time. As years passed, more details emerged that only added to the heartbreak. After Josh's death, journals and personal writings were recovered from both him and his father. Among them were entries that described disturbing fantasies, obsessive thoughts about Susan, and a growing paranoia that the world was turning against them. In Stephen Powell's belongings, investigators found explicit content that suggested a long history of predatory behavior. These findings only deepened the sense that Susan had been surrounded not just by dysfunction, but by danger on every side. Even Josh's own sister, Jennifer Graves, had tried to raise concerns before it was too late. She had long suspected something was terribly wrong, not just with her brother, but with the entire family dynamic. She gave interviews, cooperated with law enforcement, and tried to be a voice for Susan when it mattered most. Her warnings, too, went largely unheard at the time. What remained then was a legacy built not on justice in the traditional sense, but on the power of remembrance. Susan's family poured their grief into advocacy. Through the Susan Cox Powell Foundation, they worked tirelessly to educate the public about the subtleties of emotional abuse, the importance of taking threats seriously, and the signs of coercive control. They also used their platform to call for legal reform, particularly in family court systems. They questioned why Josh had been allowed visitation with the children, despite his status as a person of interest. They urged policymakers to re-examine how decisions are made in custody disputes where abuse is suspected. The hope was that other children might be protected, even if Charlie and Braden had not been. The memory of those boys was just as present as Susan's. At their funeral, photos of the children smiling and playing were placed near their small coffins. Stuffed animals sat among floral arrangements. Letters from classmates were read aloud. Their short lives, filled with potential and innocence, became the emotional core of a tragedy that had already taken so much. Over time, Susan's story began to be retold in books, documentaries, and podcasts. Each version aimed to piece together the fragments, to reconstruct what had happened, to understand the people involved, and to offer some sense of resolution, however incomplete. But even with all the storytelling, there was one truth that remained constant. Susan never stopped trying. Her voice had not been loud, but it had been clear. She had written notes, made plans, told friends, protected her children. She had not been silent in her fear, and that made her disappearance all the more painful. For many, Susan's story serves as a cautionary tale, not just about the danger of ignoring abuse, but about the many ways systems can fail. It is a reminder that not all wounds are visible, that not all cries for help sound the same, and that control can be wielded in subtle, invisible ways, until it's too late. Yet in the quiet that followed the public spectacle, in the years after the final press conference, after the case was closed and the cameras turned away, there was still movement. The desert wind still blew across the Utah landscape, volunteers still searched, and Susan's name was still spoken, not as a headline, not as a victim, but as someone worth remembering, because even in absence, Susan Cox Powell had become a presence, a symbol of strength, of resistance, of the many women whose stories are never told. She reminded the world that behind every missing person's case is a life full of dreams, family, and meaning.
The Beaumont Hotel in Beaumont, Texas stood tall and functional, nothing luxurious but dependable. Business travelers passed through with regularity, their stays brief and largely uneventful. It was the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. That made what happened in room 348 all the more perplexing. Greg Flanagan was a man of quiet habits. At 55, he'd built a comfortable life for himself. As a landman for an oil and gas company, his work often required him to travel across Texas. His job demanded long hours, but the compensation was good, and it allowed him and his wife Susie to enjoy a relatively peaceful life in Lafayette, Louisiana. Greg was methodical. He always packed the same bag, wore the same types of shirts, carried snacks like peanut M&Ms in his suitcase, and enjoyed the simple routine of his hotel evenings. He would call Susie after settling into his room, eat a snack, perhaps catch up on some sports on TV, and go to bed. Nothing about Greg's lifestyle invited attention. On the night of September 15, 2010, Greg checked into the MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont for a work trip. He called Susie at their usual time, just after 8 p.m. He was settled in and watching a movie. It was a quiet evening. Susie told him about her day, and Greg laughed softly at one of her jokes. Their conversation was short but affectionate. He promised to call again in the morning, but when morning came, the phone stayed silent. Susie wasn't immediately alarmed. Greg had been known to sleep in or miss a call occasionally if he was in a meeting, but by early afternoon, with still no word, a vague unease crept in. She called the hotel, asking the front desk to check on him. A hotel employee knocked on the door of room 348. No answer. After several attempts, they used a key card and entered. What they found was strange, not dramatic, but unsettling in its quiet stillness. Greg was lying on the floor near the foot of the bed. At first glance, it looked like a heart attack. He was fully dressed, there were no signs of a struggle, and the room was undisturbed. His wallet, phone and belongings were all present. No foul play was apparent. The room was locked from the inside. The paramedics noted no blood, no broken bones, no immediate injuries visible on the body. He hadn't fallen. It appeared he had simply collapsed. An autopsy was ordered, but no one expected what came next. The medical examiner began with the standard external exam. No signs of trauma, but when they opened Greg's chest cavity, things took a sudden turn. The internal damage was profound. His ribs were broken, his heart had been torn, and his liver was severely lacerated. There were fragments of something that looked like shrapnel or pellets embedded in his chest wall. This wasn't a heart attack. This was a homicide. Someone had inflicted catastrophic injuries, injuries consistent with a blast or a powerful strike. But there were no wounds on the outside of Greg's body to match the internal destruction. No burns, no bruises, no entry point. The mystery deepened. Beaumont police were stunned. A man found alone in a locked hotel room with no sign of struggle, and yet injuries consistent with a massive internal explosion. It didn't make sense. They considered exotic possibilities, electrocution, some sort of industrial accident, or even spontaneous combustion, as bizarre as it sounded. Detectives combed through Greg's background. There was no one with a grudge against him, no enemies, no financial troubles, no affairs, no questionable history. He was by all accounts a straight arrow. Police re-examined the hotel room. They brought in forensic teams to test for explosives or any residue. Nothing. The room remained completely intact. No scorch marks, no broken windows, no damage to the furniture. It was as if Greg had imploded from within. Susie was devastated, not just by her husband's death, but by the confusion surrounding it. She had always known Greg as predictable, safe and calm. The idea that someone had murdered him, somehow invisibly, left her feeling untethered. She attended the funeral with trembling hands and a mind spinning with unanswered questions. Meanwhile, the detectives dug deeper. Surveillance footage from the hallway outside room 348 was reviewed. Hotel guests in adjacent rooms were interviewed. One guest had heard a loud pop the night Greg died, but dismissed it as possibly someone dropping luggage or slamming a door. No one had seen anything suspicious. It was then that the investigators made a pivotal decision. They needed to understand the room itself. Not just the physical space, but what had happened inside and around it. They took precise measurements, reenacted Greg's final moments, considered everything from poison to exotic weapons, and then came a breakthrough, not from a piece of physical evidence, but from a subtle clue. A detective noticed something strange during a re-inspection. In the wall shared between room 348, where Greg had been staying, and the neighboring room 349, there was a small fresh indentation, barely visible. Upon closer inspection, they found a hole that had been patched with a quick bit of plaster. Something had gone through the wall, a projectile of some kind. The investigation shifted to room 349. The guest registered to that room was a man named Lance Miller, an oil worker from North Dakota, who had been in town with a crew doing refinery work. He had checked out the day after Greg's death. Police tracked him down several states away and brought him in for questioning. What Miller told them unraveled everything. That night, Miller and his co-workers had been drinking in room 349. One of them had brought a small, illegally modified firearm, a Derringer-style pistol designed to be a novelty, but still capable of firing a real round. In a moment of reckless drunkenness, one of the men aimed the gun and pulled the trigger. The bullet pierced the wall, and on the other side, unseen and unknown to them, it struck Greg Flanagan in the abdomen as he lay watching a movie on his bed. He likely never even had time to react. The round had torn through him, bouncing internally, causing the massive injuries that ultimately killed him. It left no exterior wound large enough to betray what had happened. No blood trail, no broken furniture, just internal chaos and quiet death. The men in room 349 heard the pop and panicked. Realizing what had happened, they quietly patched the hole in the wall and said nothing. They left the next morning. Greg's death was declared a homicide.
The man who pulled the trigger eventually pled guilty to manslaughter and served a prison sentence, but the weight of the incident went far beyond legal consequences. It was the kind of death that almost didn't happen. One poor decision, one random angle, one unmarked wall between two rooms. A man who had never met his killer. A life ended by someone who never meant to take it, but did. Greg's wife, Susie, would later describe the pain of not just losing her husband, but of losing him in such an unfathomable way, not to rage or vengeance or even malice, but to a careless act wrapped in stupidity and silence. The randomness of it only magnified her grief. The case of Greg Flanagan would go on to be cited in forensic seminars, investigative training, and criminal justice programs, not because of the drama, but because of the subtlety. A man murdered by a bullet no one saw, in a room with no sign of a crime, by a person who didn't even know his name. And that is how it began. In the aftermath of the revelation, the quiet hallways of the MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas, became the unlikely scene of one of the most peculiar criminal investigations in recent memory. The hotel, with its conference rooms and uniform decor, was now etched into the lives of people who had never expected to find themselves in the center of a homicide. Once it was discovered that a bullet had entered Greg Flanagan's room from room 349, everything changed. It wasn't a mystery anymore, it was a chain of small choices, each one stacking precariously atop the next, until one man's life was taken, and others would never be the same. The detective who noticed the indentation in the wall, a seasoned investigator named Scott Apple, had been troubled from the start. The absence of external wounds, the neatness of the hotel room, the complete lack of struggle, all of it suggested something unnatural. And yet the coroner's report was brutally clear. Greg had not simply collapsed. His injuries resembled those from a vehicular collision, or a bomb. It was only through the slow, quiet attention to detail, measurements, light studies and analysis of the room's layout, that the truth began to surface. In room 349, investigators found what remained of a crude patch job, plaster over a bullet hole. The drywall was not thick between the rooms. A small caliber round, under the right circumstances, could easily pass through, especially at close range. The bullet had entered at an angle that intersected perfectly with the spot where Greg had been resting. When authorities finally tracked down Lance Miller, the man whose name had been on the room's registry, they found him back in North Dakota. He was cooperative, if hesitant. At first he feigned ignorance, claimed he'd heard nothing, but it didn't hold. Eventually the truth came out, not from Miller alone, but from his co-workers who were also questioned. The gun had been brought to Texas by a man named Marvin Marty Kelly, another oil contractor from the same team. It was a tiny weapon, the kind one might keep as a novelty. It wasn't supposed to be taken seriously, but alcohol changes perception, lowers inhibition, and clouds judgment. On the night Greg Flanagan died, the men had been drinking heavily. Their laughter, loud voices, and roughhousing had been noted by other guests, though no one had filed a formal complaint. According to multiple accounts, Marty had pulled out the pistol to show it off. Someone joked about its size, others passed it around, amused by how small and old-fashioned it looked. And then, in what seemed like a game at the time, the trigger was pulled. There was a sharp pop, a sound almost too soft to be alarming. At first no one reacted strongly. It was only after a moment that they realized what had happened. The gun had been loaded. There was now a hole in the wall. They sat in silence. No screams came from the next room. No alarm sounded. Maybe the bullet had lodged in the wall. Maybe it hadn't hurt anyone. And maybe, most dangerously, they could pretend it hadn't happened at all. Marty panicked. He grabbed some white toothpaste and spackle from his bag, and patched the hole crudely. They covered it with furniture. The party ended. Everyone left the next morning. None of them knew, or perhaps allowed themselves to believe, that someone had died on the other side. It took nearly a year for the pieces to be fully assembled. Greg's widow, Susie Flanagan, never stopped pushing for answers. She called detectives weekly, even when there were no updates. She requested records, reviewed timelines, and asked questions most spouses in grief would find impossible to articulate. In a way, her persistence forced the case forward. Her grief refused to be quieted. She had been married to Greg for nearly 3 decades. Their life had been comfortable, if quiet. Greg wasn't the adventurous type. He liked sports, crossword puzzles, and watching movies in bed. He didn't drink heavily, didn't take risks, didn't raise his voice. He was a creature of habit, a man who brushed his teeth every night at the same time, and arranged his luggage with military precision. The thought that someone like that could die in a random act, the kind not even meant for him, was almost more than Susie could bear. The district attorney's office reviewed the case. Although the original shooter, Marty Kelly, hadn't intended to kill anyone, the circumstances surrounding the act made it impossible to dismiss as an accident. Firing a weapon into a hotel wall, intoxicated, reckless and in close quarters, was criminal behavior. Marty was charged with manslaughter. The trial itself was quiet. There was no dramatic courtroom battle, no parade of shocking witnesses, just a steady march of facts. The patched wall, the ballistic evidence, the testimony of co-workers who had watched Marty fire the weapon and said nothing. Marty pled guilty. He received a sentence that included time in prison, though not as long as some believed he deserved. He expressed remorse, said he didn't sleep through the night, that he saw Greg's face in dreams even though they had never met. But for Greg's family, no sentence would bring resolution. There was no justice that could make sense of a death so unearned. It wasn't just that Greg had died, it was how invisible it had been, how random, how thoroughly unnecessary. The bullet had passed through not only the drywall, but also the invisible boundary that separates normal life from tragedy. And what remained behind wasn't just a patched wall and a prison sentence, it was a hole that would never be filled. In time, the story faded from headlines. Most true crime stories do. But for those who knew Greg, or who had walked the halls of that hotel, the details lingered. The packed bag with the Pinot Emanes still inside. The TV paused on the movie he'd been watching. The untouched ice bucket. The perfectly made bed. He hadn't struggled. He hadn't screamed. His life had simply stopped. The crime didn't announce itself. It didn't leave shattered glass or frantic 911 calls. It was a whisper in the wall. A soft pop. A flicker of recklessness. And a man who had never been part of anyone's plan to die. The true weight of Greg Flanagan's death revealed itself not only in the details of the investigation, but in the long dull ache it left behind. Months after the headlines quieted, after the courtroom fell silent, and after the apologies were made, his absence remained a ghost in the lives of those who had known him. The tragedy didn't burn brightly like a raging fire. It lingered like a chill that never left the room. Susie Flanagan stayed in the same house they had shared for decades. Friends advised her to move, suggested that a change in scenery might bring her peace. But Susie couldn't imagine leaving behind the kitchen where Greg made his coffee each morning, or the recliner where he'd fall asleep watching football. Their home was filled with his quiet habits, his steady presence, and now his silence. She kept his closet untouched for over a year. His side of the bathroom counter still held his razor, his aftershave, and the neatly folded towel he had used on the day he left for Beaumont. For Susie, it wasn't denial, it was devotion. Greg had been taken from her in a way that defied reason. There had been no warning, no preparation, and no chance to say goodbye. The hardest part wasn't knowing he had died. It was knowing how little the world had noticed. The official reports, when finally completed, outlined everything in forensic detail. The bullet, a .380 caliber, had traveled cleanly through the drywall, separating room 349 from room 348. It had struck Greg in the lower left side, entering just above his hip. Inside his body, it bounced and tore with astonishing force, ricocheting through soft tissue, breaking ribs and rupturing vital organs. There was internal bleeding, enough to cause unconsciousness within minutes and death shortly thereafter. There had been no exit wound, no blood on the carpet, just the strange twisted physics of an unlucky trajectory. In the aftermath, hotel staff found themselves the unwilling witnesses to a tragedy they could barely understand. The housekeeper, who had discovered Greg's body in the morning, thinking at first he had merely overslept, took a leave of absence. The manager began locking the door to room 348, even when it was unoccupied. And among the long-time employees, room 349 became a room of whispers. Some refused to clean it. Others left flowers outside it each December, the month Greg had died. For the men responsible, Marty Kelly and his co-workers, the story didn't end at sentencing. Lance Muller, who had initially taken the room in his name, and later tried to minimize what he knew, was never charged. He had not fired the weapon, but in interviews afterward, he admitted that the guilt stayed with him. He recalled sitting on the edge of the bed in room 349 the night of the shooting, staring at the patch on the wall, and knowing deep down that something had gone terribly wrong. But he hadn't checked, hadn't knocked on the adjoining door, hadn't asked the front desk for help. The choice not to know had haunted him. When he returned home to North Dakota, he told no one, not his wife, not his friends. He carried it silently, like a stone in his chest. In time, it hardened into something he couldn't push down anymore. Marty Kelly, in prison, wrestled with a different kind of ghost. His initial confession, given after hours of interviews, was filled with regret and disbelief. He hadn't known the gun was loaded, he said. He'd just pulled the trigger because someone had joked about how small it looked. It was never supposed to fire. It was never supposed to kill. But that line, the one between intention and consequence, didn't erase the hole in the wall, or the life that was lost. It didn't erase the call Greg's wife received that night. It didn't undo the autopsy, or the funeral, or the empty chair at the dinner table. In court, Marty stood before the Flanagan family and apologized. His voice trembled, his words carefully chosen. He said he'd never stop thinking about what happened, that he would carry Greg with him for the rest of his life. Susie listened, but didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her grief wasn't theatrical. It was slow and sharp, a quiet sadness that filled the room more than any spoken words could. Back in Beaumont, Detective Scott Apple returned to his other cases, but this one stayed with him more than most. He had worked homicides for decades, had seen the aftermath of terrible things, knife fights, domestic abuse, gang violence, but never something like this. A death with no killer in the traditional sense. No motive, no hatred, just stupidity, just a decision made in a haze of alcohol and bravado, followed by silence and inaction. He remembered walking the hotel hallway, late at night during the investigation, just to get a feel for the space. The carpet was thick, muffling his steps. The walls were close. He stood in the spot where the bullet had passed, and imagined how quiet it must have been, how quickly it all happened. A man resting in bed watching a movie, a sudden pressure, darkness, the idea that such a small careless act could cause so much damage. It changed the way Apple saw the world. Forensic scientists later reconstructed the shot in a ballistics lab, using laser trajectories and wall mock-ups. They confirmed the bullet had indeed passed through at an unusual angle. It had likely been fired at knee height, explaining the path it took through Greg's body. The conclusion was chilling not because it was complex, but because it was so ordinary. A slight shift in angle, a few feet of space. It was all that separated Greg from life or death. The story gained national attention briefly, mentioned in true crime forums and investigative articles, but it never became a media frenzy. There was no serial killer, no dramatic chase, no twisted psychology, just a good man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a bullet that never should have been fired. Susie eventually gave away some of Greg's belongings to family members, his golf clubs to his brother, his wristwatch to their son, but she kept his wedding ring in a drawer beside her bed. On quiet nights, she still opened it, holding it in her palm as she listened to the silence around her. The hotel eventually renovated room 348 and 349, replacing the carpets and repainting the walls. But for those who knew what happened there, the memory couldn't be scrubbed away. The rooms became ordinary again. But not really. The tragedy of Greg Flanagan's death was not only in how he died, but in how easily it might have been prevented. If someone had checked the chamber, if someone had spoken up, if someone had gone next door, but no one did. And so a man who'd only wanted a quiet night in a hotel room to eat some candy and watch a movie, became the victim of a moment that everyone else tried to forget. What lingered wasn't rage. It was sorrow. The kind that settles like dust and never leaves. By the time the case of Greg Flanagan reached its quiet conclusion, the world had moved on. Other news cycles came and went. Storms, elections, scandals. But for the people who had loved him, who had truly known him, Greg's death wasn't just a headline or an unusual case solved with a forensic twist. It was a fracture in the structure of their lives, one that no amount of time could fully mend. For Susie, the legal closure did little to soften the emotional weight she carried. Marty Kelly, the man who fired the shot that killed her husband, had been sentenced to a relatively modest prison term, manslaughter, not murder. It was clear from the investigation that his act had not been one of deliberate malice. There was no intent to kill. The shot wasn't meant for anyone, and yet someone had died. She had expected to feel anger toward him, but when she saw him in the courtroom, young, red-eyed and shaking, what she felt instead was a profound and exhausting sadness. A man who made a stupid, careless decision, who could not have known the cost of his moment of recklessness, and who now had to carry that weight for the rest of his life. The court records would say that Marty fired a gun and killed a man, but the deeper truth was that he created a ripple, a silent tsunami of grief, confusion and trauma that swept through more lives than he could have ever imagined. Susie knew that Greg's death had changed her. Her world had become smaller, quieter. Even years later, she found herself listening for the sound of the garage door in the late afternoon, still half expecting his car to pull in, his keys to jingle in the lock, his familiar voice to call out for her from the kitchen. The habits of their life together were stitched deep into her routine. Their absence had become a second skin. She didn't remarry. She didn't move. Her neighbors continued to check on her, and her friends made sure she wasn't alone on holidays. But there was a stillness to her days now, a hush that seemed to settle in the corners of each room. Their son, Jason, had taken the news hard. At first he couldn't believe it. How could someone die in a hotel room from a gunshot wound no one heard, no one intended, and no one noticed? The randomness of it made him furious. For months he cycled through disbelief, rage and numbness. He tried to be strong for his mother, to take care of the things Greg once handled, but grief doesn't follow a straight line. And Jason's loss, compounded by the sheer absurdity of the way it had happened, took its own jagged course. He eventually found his way to therapy, not because he wanted to talk, but because he couldn't carry the silence anymore. There, slowly he learned to make room for the grief rather than try to box it away. Greg had been more than a father. He had been a constant, a compass, and his absence had left Jason drifting. Detective Scott Apple, too, found the case leaving echoes in his thoughts. It wasn't the most gruesome case he'd worked, nor the most high profile, but it was in some ways the most senseless. He remembered replaying it in his mind, over and over, walking into room 349, the air conditioner humming, the smell of old carpet, the unremarkable stillness, and yet a man had died there. A good man, a man with no enemies, no secrets, just a wife waiting for him to come home. Apple often found himself thinking about the wall, the thin painted drywall that separated two lives. Greg on one side watching television, and three men on the other, drinking, laughing, showing off a gun, that fragile barrier between life and death, between carelessness and catastrophe. The final ballistics reports confirmed what had long been suspected. The bullet had passed through the wall at a low angle, just high enough to strike a man reclining in bed. The odds of that trajectory were so small, so unlikely, that some investigators described it as a freak accident. But accident didn't seem to capture the weight of it. Not for Susie. Not for Greg's family. Not for anyone who had seen the aftermath. The hotel, a modest business-oriented chain, quietly updated their policies after the case. They added new signage in rooms, added reinforced soundproofing to connecting walls, and retrained staff in emergency response. Management made no public statements about the incident, but the staff remembered. Most of them would never forget the night the quiet man in room 349 died, unnoticed, because of someone else's recklessness next door. Room 349 eventually went back into rotation. New guests came and went, unaware of the story behind the door. The carpet was new, the bed replaced, even the wall had been patched and repainted. But every now and then, a housekeeper would pause outside that room and remember. Some left the lights on just a little longer while they cleaned. A few lit small candles in the hallway on the anniversary of Greg's death. The gesture wasn't about religion, it was about memory. About honoring a man who had died with no warning, in a place that should have been safe. As for Marty Kelly, prison changed him. In letters he later wrote to the court, he described his guilt as a daily burden. He said he often dreamed of the moment the gun went off, only to wake in the dark sweating and shaking. He wrote about how the sound of drywall cracking haunted him, how he saw Greg's face even though they had never met. In those letters, he didn't beg for forgiveness, he didn't make excuses, he simply said he was sorry. Over and over, after serving his sentence, he was released quietly. No press covered his return, no protests greeted him. He moved far away, changed his last name, and got a job repairing air conditioners. It was honest work, quiet work, and some days, he said, the silence was unbearable. He never touched a gun again. What remained years after it all ended was a story with no heroes and no villains, just people, flawed, ordinary people, whose lives crossed paths in an extraordinary way. Greg Flanagan had lived a simple, principled life. He loved his wife. He worked hard. He didn't chase attention or controversy. And yet his story became unforgettable, not because of who he was in public, but because of how unfairly and invisibly he was taken. That was the hardest part for Susie, and for those who loved him. Not just that he died, but that it took so long for anyone to notice. She kept his watch in a drawer by her bed. Sometimes she wound it and listened to the ticking. It still worked, keeping time as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't tilted, as if one quiet night in a Beaumont hotel hadn't ended in a ripple of sorrow. But Susie knew better. The world had changed. Her world had changed. And for as long as she lived, she would remember the man who never came home, not just for how he died, but for how he lived.